Let me just share my slides a moment. Okay, great. Well, hi everyone. So yeah, I mean, I don't need to repeat that, obviously, but I'm Charles. So yes, not repeating the blurb, but I'd like to just start with why I've focused on this. Actually, this is a topic that I've recently got more closely interested in. Not what I've actually been researching, and this for good reason. A lot of what I've researched before was kind of from sociological perspectives. What I'm doing now is trying to get a bit more transdisciplinary to get to the root of problems I think they're not being solved. Nobody's focusing on them, so I thought I need to change direction. So this is the beginning of a new episode for me in terms of my my research interests. Okay, so why this topic? Well, first of all, it's personal. I have ADHD myself, and I've always struggled with listening in all sorts of contexts, in my native context, but also in my second language learning. I lived in Spain for 10 years, and I really struggled to really pick up Spanish over time, and I thought maybe I was just not very good at it, that kind of self-blame thing. But I was really struggling with listening, just feeling like I wasn't picking up anything. And that was one side, my personal experience, but also my professional experience. I've really noticed, kind of anecdotally, students struggling more than they might in ways that I kind of recognize in my own second language learning, that they kind of seem competent and pretty good in other skills, but really, really struggling with listening. And also bringing in the factor of time as well. This idea of time sense. People with ADHD have anecdotally reported, it's not part of the diagnostic criteria, but problems with time, being late, being too early, like in my case, and just not being able to judge what a unit of time actually is in reality without looking at a timepiece directly. So I've noticed that, and I thought, surely I'm struggling with myself and my students might be struggling with this in terms of time. And how does listening come into that? I thought the skill of listening surely is going to be an issue with that more than maybe other skills. Okay, good. So let's get started a little bit then in terms of what we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about kind of a description of what is ADHD in terms of its kind of basic characteristics, how that might kind of influence their ability in class in terms of how their listening problems that they might have. There's I'm hoping that this can spur more research, because there isn't much about this. There really isn't. There's not much research about ADHD and second language learning, let alone EFL and EAP. So a lot of this is going to be potential avenues for research in the future, I think. Okay, the problem of time perception. So then I bring that in, because that's really what I'm starting to believe is something that could be underpinning some of the other problems that actually happen in the class that might be listed as behavioral or kind of general cognitive problems. Okay, and then I'm going to invite you to start looking at some tasks that are typical in EAP from the theorist, de Chazal, for example, suggesting tasks that can help listeners in class, but just your so-called neurotypical listeners. And then we can talk about how that might affect the ADHD listener, or neurodiverse listener. And I got actions, so not just about that particular task, but kind of how we might generally help out. And this kind of area here, there might not be clear borders. We can go straight into some discussion or some questions that you might have asked. So I'm kind of asking you to kind of contribute more in those later stages, the listening, task, and AP classroom evaluation, action, discussion. But you can write in questions as we go, so you can, so you don't have to remember them, into the chat, and we can manage them from there. Okay, let's move on then. Takeaways. I do apologize for, I didn't realize it, but that the image that I took from PowerPoint images has actually got a Starbucks coffee on there. I'm not promoting Starbucks at all. I particularly don't particularly like it, but so ignore that. No, I shouldn't have said anything. You might not have noticed. Anyway, so that's not the topic we're talking about. Focus, Charles. Okay, so let's then talk about the kind of takeaways from this. So obviously a bit of awareness of ADHD in our context. And like I said, you might be able to be more aware than I am right now, especially those who are working full time in the AEP, what's happening in those contexts that you might be increasingly be aware of after this session. Understanding of ADHD impairments relating maybe more specifically to listening, but I'm sure the other skills might be affected too. And also, like I mentioned before, this issue of action. So thinking and reflecting and adapting practices possibly, and possibly, if you're interested, want to get connected, future research. I really need it. I'm desperate. And remember that a lot of this is transferable, meaning that this can help students in general in the second language, because a lot of time the research that I talk about, the studies, are actually related not to second language learners. Like there's a big difference there, there's a big gulf that needs to be kind of spoken about. But any listener, and especially second language listeners, whether they've got ADHD or any other issues of language impairment, that it's going to help. So it's not just ADHD specific, and not necessarily EAP specific either. Okay, good. So the first question, what is ADHD? Well, ADHD has been described as a neurodevelopmental disorder. This is mainly characterized by inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsiveness. Now, there are three main subtypes. One is inattentive, which I have. Another is the hyperactive impulsive, and a third is a combination of those, a kind of equal combination of those. The third one's actually rarer. It's not so common from what I've read, but the other two are relatively common. Now, inattentive, predominantly inattentive one, I think is actually the most common, and it's more common over the age ranges. So adults, if they were hyperactive when they're young, are likely to still have ADHD, but it's going to revert to inattention when they have a little bit more control of their kind of behavior. So the hyperactive impulsive is a stereotypical child jumping around the classroom, typically a boy, rambunctious, emotional, can't concentrate, can't sit down. That's the classic example. But the inattentive is the daydreamer, or the name that I got called even by my teachers at school was, there's Charles, the space cadet. Thanks for that, teachers. And even in my own family, I called it as well. So I was pretty much not concentrating on anything that's going on that was important. Okay, and girls and women have been unfortunately underdiagnosed with ADHD, partly because they have more of the inattentive type. So at school, they're not really causing too much trouble. So, okay, we'll forget them. So the one that's causing trouble, we need to solve that problem. Okay, the further characteristics that's typical of all of these subtypes is response inhibition, interference control, reasoning, hindsight, and working memory issues. Now, each of those, like I said, is characteristic of all subtypes, but in different kind of, depending on abilities to control, and adults tend to have more control over certain aspects than obviously children would. Response inhibition is, for example, there's many examples, is blurting out in class, kind of speaking without thinking, saying something but not considering what you're saying and the consequences first. So very typical with those children, but to be honest, it does still happen with adults, and I am guilty of interrupting and blurting out things myself, which not always best, but it happens less, I would say, with adulthood. Depends on the context, but sometimes if you're over emotional, tired, I tend to have less control of those things, and I do tend to not be popular in meetings sometimes because of that. But I do obviously apologize for it. Interference control can be characterized with a very typical, everyone's heard of this being, driven to distraction, this being distracted, not be able to control any interference that's coming in to your senses. It could be from the environment, could be what's going on even in your own head, but just not being able to really control that distraction and kind of push it away. Great, and then there's reasoning problems. I give it maybe a simple example, but it can be quite complex, this, and hard to measure, and without kind of close kind of psychiatric kind of conditions. But reasoning might typically happen in our environments with like poor planning and decision making, not preparing for class, etc., deciding to leave the room and go to the toilet. That was my favorite. A bad decision to make, but in a situation where you're getting kind of overwhelmed, it might be what you might do, right? So I'm just going to go to the toilet because I'm being overwhelmed right now. So maybe a bad decision in that moment. Problems of hindsight. I mean, there's also problems of foresight, but I think commonly I've read more about this hindsight issue. And again, learning from mistakes. And even as an adult, I do still have a problem with such things. And I've noticed that students will kind of repeat behavior as well, not necessarily with ADHD, but they tend to kind of repeat behaviors that they know are not working for them. They'll just keep doing it. And that might be due to the issues of kind of not great reasoning, so they kind of might influence each other quite a lot. And another one is working memory. This is a famous one as well, being forgetful, forgetting the keys. That's a famous one for ADHD, forgetting keys. I've worked out strategies. I've got my 3-point check. I've got keys in this pocket, phone in this pocket, and wallet. Where's my wallet? Wallet in the pocket with the phone as well. But working memory is a very short-term memory that obviously is kind of almost split-second storing of information in sequence. So, for example, written and verbal instructions, giving instructions in class, in my experience, I could notice issues. It's a problem for any second language learner, obviously, and working memory can be problematic in this moment where you've got a bit of delay and pause and kind of processing what the teacher's just said. But with ADHD, that's another level again. So even in your own language, this quick processing of sequenced information like that can be a problem. And this is something we'll talk about later, which is super important. So basically, what we're considering, all of these kind of features are what's described as ADHD as primarily being a disorder of executive functioning. So these things are necessary. To have good control of these things is a way to be able to deal with everyday life and tasks that happen in everyday life. So you can imagine why it's called that. So if you're having problems with these areas, you're having problems in your everyday life. Don't ask me about my bills right now. Okay, great. So let's move on a little bit. I want to talk about, because I said at the beginning that I don't like what's been done so far in research in terms of in education a lot of the time. A lot of it is kind of a little bit more sociological or social psychological, and there's nothing wrong with that. That helps, especially interpretivism. We can get experiences from individuals with ADHD and how they might be struggling. But in the end, we need to know maybe what is the source of that struggle a little bit more, so we can actually target, so we don't end up with executive functioning, because it might be something that's more fundamental to learning. Because a lot of learning, right from this very kind of, not to be essentialist, but right from its very source, is kind of that firing of neurons in your brain and then making connections between neurons. I'm not saying that we open up brains and start doing brain surgery, but there's things that we can do. I was going to change the title of this whole thing to actually bring back drilling, kind of. I'll come back to that later. Okay, so like I said, I kind of want to move into a little bit of kind of, I'm a social realist in my kind of other research, my sociological research, and I believe that there are certain mechanisms, it's an unfortunate term, but mechanisms in the social world, but in the brain there are definitely mechanisms that help with our learning and our awareness of our environments around us. So I saw it described in a video on ADD magazine on YouTube. So it's not actually been like a published term or anything, but some suggest that ADHD is an interest-based nervous system. It doesn't mean that you're consciously necessarily interested in things. So I'm bored of this class, I'm not interested. No, it's saying that it's at the basis of a nervous system basis to it. So your response is not necessarily passed through functions such as reasoning. It's actually sometimes a very immediate nervous system response. So those parts of the brain that are responsible for all aspects of our behavior and our awareness in the world are, for example, the prefrontal cortex. Now, I'm no expert in the brain here, but I'm pretty sure it's somewhere at the front and it's pre. Okay, so, but it's somewhere at the front. Anyway, the regulation of attention, behavior, and emotion. Well, this is the executive functioning, isn't it? Well, partly, yes. It's partly this is what's helping us with our executive functioning. It's helping us to, what I found in the literature, Wilcott et al. Suggested starting, sustaining, and shifting and stopping. These are the problems in executive function that seem to be apparent in our classroom. So if we can't control our starting, our sustaining, our shifting, and our stopping, then we're having problems regulating behaviors in this way. So we might not be being able to pay attention enough to be able to start, sustain, shift, and stop. Now, we're not being stimulated massively by what's going on if we can't start or sustain something. And if we can't shift or stop, maybe we're overstimulated. Okay, so we all are aware possibly that ADHD is related to dopamine regulation in the brain, that reward chemical. So if we do something we enjoy, it says, yeah, do that again, and then we seek it, we look for it, but not looking necessarily consciously, but kind of, you just respond immediately to something that stimulates you. Now, dopamine is found in all parts of the brain, the regulators, the receptors in all parts of the brain, including the cerebellum, which in the literature is suggested it houses an internal clock mechanism. Now, this internal clock mechanism is not literally a clock, obviously, but it's something in that part of the brain, in the biology of that brain, in the electricity that's happening in that brain, in waves, that's kind of indicating of a clock, like a pacemaker, more like. So it's kind of helping us to kind of make judgments of our existence in terms of a kind of temporal judgments. Now that's housed right in the cerebellum, which I think is that pinky bit towards the bottom there. Don't quote me on that, but it's there somewhere, and apparently it does help us with our everyday functioning in terms of our temporal processing, our temporal world. And then there's the basal ganglia, which is response control, amongst other things, but that's right in a kind of central lower region there that helps us deal with our response control. Now, again, with this kind of dopamine being distributed and regulated and signs and signals being sent to all different parts of the brain, then you can imagine that if there's issues with those parts of the brain, then those messages might not being sent very well. So this is interesting because what's been found in a lot of neuroscience research is that parts of these brains are underdeveloped. When we say a neurodevelopmental order, it's also a kind of biological development. It's often found that these parts of the brain maybe have less gray matter or whatever, but some parts of the brain, like the left hemisphere, is literally smaller than those who are maybe more neurotypical. Other conditions, language learning impairments, as dyslexia, also have possible reduced left hemisphere. Now, it's not all bad, meaning, if you remember, I said that the starting, sustaining, shifting, and stopping, I can work all night if I'm really into something, right? But I just can't stop, so maybe it's bad for me, but I can get things done. If I got a deadline, you got to do this by tomorrow morning, I can do it. So I sometimes need that to kind of really get me motivated and push. And I've noticed some of the students do that late night thing, right? Not just because they have ADHD, but some of them really get results done. And I really fear when I'm supervising dissertations, like, they're not going to get it done, and they get it done. And I think to myself, wow, have you got ADHD? Because they actually get it done. And I remember my experience doing exactly the same thing. Okay, great. So I'm sorry this is very rapid, but I hope you're getting the idea about this idea of kind of regulating behavior based on those kind of aspects of dopamine regulation, possibly affecting our timing, our internal basic mechanism of timing. And this is what's going to be important for us today. So what about the ADHD listener in our class then? Well, obviously not purposely sticking their fingers in their ears, but the ADHD listener in class is going to be distracted, it's going to be disorganized, is going to not be very attentive to all tasks unless they're really super interested in them. They can have limited and heightened alertness due to that dopamine dysregulation going on. They're going to be having specific listening difficulties, and they also speak too quickly for themselves, so they're making mistakes like myself right now, sorry. Okay, so they might have specific listening difficulties due to those neurological problems that are going on in their brain. So distracted, disorganized, inattentive, limited and heightened alertness, so maybe looking interested and then looking absolutely bored and staring out the window, and then having specific listening difficulties. Right, so what might those kind of difficulties be? Well, I organize them into external and internal, but it's not really a theoretical separation, and obviously they're not absolutely exclusive, but they are analytically different, I would say, in terms of how we might, if you think about how we might respond and adapt practices, you could think of them in different spheres. So I've got external, which is really a distracting learning environment. So you imagine if you're sitting too close. I remember at school just being allowed to sit next to the window, but it was a worse place for me to be because I was completely just staring out the window and being distracted by everything going on. But you could be distracted by what's going on in the classroom. You could be distracted by the teacher's awful tie. I don't know. Anything can distract. And to be honest, you don't know what is going to distract you from one day to the next and from one moment to the next. So distracting a learning environment is very an issue. You can imagine we could make some changes, but it would be practically impossible if we don't know what they're going to be distracted by. The other one would be internal. So this is the kind of the more brain things that are going on, which of course are going to be clearly influenced by the environment. But then there's a kind of processing of that internally, which is going to be problematic. So a lot of the research suggests that people with ADHD are going to have problems in discriminating stimuli. And that typically, if it's auditory, obviously, is sounds. So they're not able to tell the difference between sounds, to identify particularly important information that's coming through in an auditory fashion. They're also going to have problems recognizing patterns, so pattern recognition, due to possibly not processing the information in between the steps of the pattern. Again, instructions is a classic, isn't it? That you might get a bit of the first instruction, but processing that, you miss the next part of the next instruction. That's definitely what I go through. Also, in auditory processing, the idea of locating a sound source. I'm often like that animal in the forest that's just doesn't know where the sound's coming from. I often do camping in forests and I'm like, what's that? Where's that coming from? And also in an environment that's already distracting, trying to locate that sound source might be an issue in deciding what is actually the important signal that's coming through. Of course, degraded. So we've got degraded auditory signals. I don't know if you ever played audio before, and it's a bit of a bad recording, and everyone's like, "We can't hear it, we can't hear it," right? You imagine someone with ADHD, they're going to have even more problems, partly maybe because of the distractions of other distractions going on. But the fact that it's not easy to decipher is really going to affect their ability to process the very minute details of the information that's coming through. Like, again, problem for everyone. Nobody likes a degraded signal. I never liked those tasks. You remember when you're learning a language, it's like somebody's in the street and they got like street noises. I'm like, I don't understand anything they're saying because I'm too distracted. I'm kind of listening to the street noises and I'm not really focusing on what they're doing. And I just can't hear it. So also competing auditory signals. It's a bit like the problem of discriminating. But if you've got lots and lots of signals coming in, different sounds coming from different sources, to discriminate and be able to identify, which one it is. So if you've got too many competing sounds, it's going to be problematic to identify the important sounds coming through. And then, of course, temporal processing. A lot of information that's thrown at us in terms of auditory information is not random. It's not just thrown at us. It's actually already organized in a sequential pattern. And being able to process that in a kind of temporal sequential pattern is very difficult if you're missing information along the way. The whole process gets thrown out. Okay, so hopefully we're starting to realize those two distinct, but obviously crossing over, they're influencing each other. Right, so further to that, we might witness, if you're lucky, observing two aspects of delay, or you might not observe it because it's happening at such a fast speed, but a speed that's enough, or delay that's enough, microseconds, for example, that will inhibit understanding or processing of information. So one part is delay aversion. Now, delay aversion means that impatient, wanting to respond, but often delay aversion is wanting to respond, but they haven't really processed all the information. I tend to do that, and I realize I've got nothing to say because I haven't really processed it. And I notice that sometimes with students, but sometimes I think maybe they're just trying to recall. Maybe they're just, and it's a second language, typical problem of a lot of second language learners. They're trying to recall. But in some of the students that I've, especially as an academic tutor at York University last year, that I noticed a particular student that was really struggling to kind of, order information that they just learned and trying to get ahead of themselves. And I noticed that a lot, but also the opposite, a kind of delayed response, like a thinking time may come across as a long thinking time, or you won't even notice it. It'd be delayed, but it'd be a split second delay. That means they've missed information, right? So they're delayed because they're processing at a slower rate, possibly. So that's one thing that might be witnessed. But another one is speech processing itself. So we talked about audio processing, and then speech obviously usually is coming across in an audio fashion. So they're actually having problems processing speech, so which might influence that delay that's happening. People with ADHD, like I mentioned before, and other learning language impairments, such as dyslexia, might have a reduced left hemisphere. And the left hemisphere deals with language, deals with logic and details. So they're going to be missing details that are not going to be following a particular logic, like a sequence. And they will also be having problems with kind of processing the sounds that are coming in at the time. So that can be affected by distraction, noise, noise effects, etc. But also, interestingly, I hope this is interesting anyway, if we're talking about language learning, is phonological recognition, processing, and storage. Now, basically, phonemes coming at you at a rapid rate, that you have to process each one almost automatically. Now, this is controversial, but this idea that memory is not involved because it's too fast. Memory is activated over 1,000 milliseconds, like a second, basically. At a second and above is when our working memory starts kicking in. But before that, at the rate that phonemes need to be processed, it's too fast to be able to store it in memory. So it has to be, in some ways, stored automatically. Well, that's controversial, I know. But, apparently, that's what they assume is happening in neurotypicals, who tend to do this a lot better than someone with ADHD or other speech processing issues. So also in relation to that, like I said, that speech coming at you is not random, it is temporally encoded. It has sequence that needs to be encoded by the person who's processing it, and it often happens at an automatic rate before we push in the working memory function to kind of drag it together and make connections with that information. So with ADHD, there seems to be evidence, as with other conditions of the left hemisphere, that it's not happening how we would like it to happen. So that's why they might be not picking things up, and it's happening at a rapid rate, which is almost not noticeable to the outside observer, and definitely confusing and annoying for the listener, because you just think that you're just not getting it and that you're stupid or something. That was my experience. But it's obviously something that an automatic processing that's kind of not happening. Okay, but we need to talk about time perception, how this comes in. I talked about temporal encoding, so that's a link here. Problems of temporal encoding is related to maybe a problem of time perception. Okay, so time perception, what is it? Well, it's this ability really to be able to predict, anticipate, respond to efficiently to upcoming information at that rapid speed a lot of the time. So these are important words that I hope you can remember, because we're going to come back to them. This ability to predict, anticipate, respond efficiently to upcoming information. So you're already thinking, right? Oh my God, right? That's really what you need to do when you're listening in a class, whether it's a listening skills task or just generally listening. So if ADHD people are suffering with this in their normal native language situations, what's happening in the second language? We've got double processing problems to be able to anticipate, respond efficiently to upcoming information. Right, time perception in the neuroscience literature that I've been struggling to understand is measured in a particular way. So how is perception measured? Is it done in a kind of fully interpretive way? Well, no, it's actually done in a way which is kind of, well, partly, because if you ask someone a question, then it's going to be an interpretation of a question. But it's also done in a way where you actually measure temporal judgments or responses or accuracies. So often it's done in these particular tasks. This is kind of quite complex, but hopefully you get the basic idea that an estimation task is a task where they're pretty much asked to estimate how long a duration of time is with a stimuli, for example, white noise. So they might listen to some white noise for a very brief interval. For example, 0.5 seconds, 500 milliseconds. So they hear that, and they'll be asked how long they think it is, right? Obviously, they won't go down to the very minute milliseconds, because you have to 0.15, and nobody's going to know that. People get an idea of like a half a second at least, but generally they go up. So they've got 0.5, 1 second, 2 seconds. So they have like those as intervals. So a 500 millisecond interval, then a 1 second interval, and they go up. As you might imagine, those estimates, as they go up, are going to load more and work in memory because of how much time passes. But at the lower interval, the 0.5, that's going to be a little bit more focused on being able to process automatically. So that's why it's important, this task, in terms of how they might estimate accurately. So it's about kind of estimating accurately. And if over 1 second, what they'll often do is to calculate the deviation from the target. So if it's supposed to be 1 second, how much the neurotypical and the ADHD listener actually deviates from that target. As you might imagine already, there's going to be a difference there, and there is a difference. Okay, so estimating time intervals, how long, but also discrimination, where they get to compare intervals. For example, they might have to compare 200 millisecond interval, which is very little, but it's still something that's perceivable, with a 1 second interval, and they'll compare them and ask, which one is longer, which one is shorter? So you imagine if it's 200 milliseconds and 1000 milliseconds, they can discriminate quite easily. Well, obviously that second one was the longest, right? But what happens is they'll do like a staircase effect. So they'll move down from 1000 down into the milliseconds, right? And that's when they start noticing inaccuracies in discriminating which one is longer and which one is shorter. Now, as you imagine, that's a bigger problem for those with ADHD. They start to become very inaccurate in judging which one is longer and which one is shorter, where the neurotypical are amazingly accurate. It's incredible how accurate they can be at millisecond levels of discrimination. Now, these tasks can be, done in terms of production and reproduction, typically. So production, really, they'll say, it's not used very often because it's controversial in terms of kind of judging what 2 seconds even means, but they'll say, can you hold down the space bar on the computer for 2 seconds, please? And they're asked to not count in their head. Like, how do they know someone's not counting in their head? But they're like, press for 2 seconds, and they'll make a judgment, on how, by pressing the bar, and then they'll judge the accuracy of if they got that right. So that's controversial because you have to hold in your head what 2 seconds are, and remember, like I said at the beginning, like my judgment of, if someone says how long is 2 seconds, can you do that? I'm lost unless I can kind of have reference to like 1, 2, or I can actually look at a timepiece. So it does say something. It indicates a problem of time sense, but it's not accurate in suggesting that they have an inaccuracy in terms of actual perception of time. Now, the other one, the most common one really is reproduction tasks, where they're asked to listen and repeat. So they hear a white noise, beep, like that, and then they'll be asked to repeat that in terms of its duration by pressing a key. Now, obviously, the space of time after they've heard it actually might invoke working memory at this point. So a lot of reproduction tasks could rely on working memory, much more than, say, just an average estimation task that might not give you much time between intervals to actually bring in your working memory. So I hope you've understood that. I'm still trying to get my head around it as well, by the way. So, and the trouble is, a lot of the research, they don't use the same tasks. They do different tasks and they adjust the tasks. And instead of white noise, it's going to be a different sound. And that could affect things, actually, especially with somebody who's easily distracted. They might find a particular sound exhilarating. So they'd be like, ugh, and then they've lost it, and they've lost the, but that's, again, tells us something about what might be happening in that brain. Okay, so hopefully we've got that a little bit, but what comes from it is actually really interesting. So what comes from that is a problem of a deficit. Again, this is the words that are used, not my own words, but a deficit in duration discrimination. So people with ADHD tend to be inaccurate when they are discriminating durations. These are probably the most common tests, and they really are inaccurate. So they tend to have a higher threshold, which means, if you're reducing from 1,000 down to 200 milliseconds, they're unable to identify which one is longer or shorter around about 750 milliseconds. So just under a second, they start failing to identify which one is longer or shorter. But the neurotypical, like I said, is amazing. Like, they are so close to the 200, right? They might be out by about 100 or so milliseconds, but the ADHD is out by hundreds possibly at this point. So you might think hundreds of milliseconds, that doesn't really mean anything. Think about those phonemes. They're coming at you at a rapid rate and a lot less than hundreds of milliseconds. So duration discrimination deficit is noticed. So they're noticing that there are impairments in the milliseconds. So typically, a lot of the research suggests that a neurotypical might get, kind of 100 milliseconds overestimate of the target, say 200 milliseconds. They're going to be 100 over, so they're going to be a bit slow, right, in processing. But ADHD is going to be at least plus 50 and more, hundreds over that. So these impairments, although seemingly small in those milliseconds, are significant. And this is suggesting, according to the literature, as a pure time deficit. So it's not a working memory deficit, which is a part of a time deficit. So it's not those issues that maybe are happening in executive functioning. There's messages being sent in the executive functioning struggling directly, although it is what's happening sometimes. A pure deficit is suggesting that there are other mechanisms at play in processing in the microseconds, right? So it's happening very quickly and probably automatically without the need for memory. So this is a pure time deficit that could be related to that little clock. Now, I want to come back to a little bit about those tasks, that those deficits relate to different kinds of estimation as well. And it will depend on the kind of task and how it poses a question, whether it poses a question before they listen or after. I thought I'd need to bring this in just for a moment, because if you ask a question that is retrospective, well, you don't even ask the question. You play, for example, boop, and then you say, how long was that, right? Now that relies a little bit in the time that you get your thinking time to respond. That actually will require you to move to your memory activation, and involves passive information holding. So you don't even know what you should be listening for. Hopefully we don't do any tasks like that anymore, where you don't give them a reason to listen directly or a question to listen. But you can imagine that forcing them to kind of rely on memory is problematic, especially when they're having to process information and they don't know what's important information at a very rapid rate. The other one that seems to be in the literature, a very big problem, is the problem of prospective estimation, which is a little bit different, meaning that you are kind of given or posed, you get a question that's asking you about time, how long, now listen, right? So when they're doing that, it relies a lot on active online processing, so that kind of rapid processing in a kind of sequential way. So whatever the upcoming information is, that will be necessary to answer their questions. So it's requiring a very close attention. Now, again, if it's not activating automatically to suck in some of that information at the microsecond level, then what some of the research suggests is that the ADHD brain, when it starts failing, sends signals to the prefrontal cortex saying, please memorize this. And that's when, boom, things get thrown off, right? It's being activated when it shouldn't be activated. So they noticed that this prospective estimation, kind of thinking ahead, if you like, that problem of, what was it? Predicting, anticipating, responding. So the predicting, the anticipating, the responding starts to fail because of the demands being pushed to attention. You just can't keep up. Right, so hopefully you are keeping up. Promise we're getting to the interesting bit for you in a moment. Okay, so is this the internal clock then? Is the clock causing all these problems? Well, yes. The research suggests that people with ADHD have a faster internal clock. This kind of pacemaker is faster than the neurotypical. And you think, well, what's wrong with that? Surely they need to be fast. They need to be keeping up, right? But the problem is the keeping up is almost independent of the actual clock. So the clock allows you to pace micro time at a rate that's not too different from a neurotypical, so very, very fast. But with possible extra stimulation, apparently that clock speeds up even more, which it doesn't so much with the neurotypical. I've just been reading an article about people doing sport where they raise their pulse, or people take stimulant drugs in a similar way as you might imagine people who take Ritalin, that stimulating drug in ADHD, that actually speeds up the pacemaker. Now they don't know what happens between that pacemaker and processing. It's kind of like a missing gap, but they kind of think it is influencing the processing. Now, interestingly, shockingly in a way, the faster the pacemaker, the lower the processing speed. It's almost like you're too ahead of yourself, that your clock is too ahead, that it's kind of showing an inability to process what it's already should be processing automatically. Processing is dependent on certain things, such as dependent on reaction time, visual scanning, learning new material, recall abilities, and motor timing. So the low processing speed would then suggest that to react, you need to be at a speed that's quicker in some way. Your visual scanning needs to be quicker, the learning needs to be quicker, but it's not if that speed is slowed down, that processing is slowed down to a rate where the rapid information is not being stored. So yeah, like I said, dopamine might be affecting this if you've got high levels of it racing through your system, or if you might be on your Ritalin medication at that particular point, is possible too. Whoops, I've gone the wrong way. Okay, so yeah, this idea that what they found in the research is that the overestimation of intervals seems to be linked to the faster clock and the lower processing speed. So, I mean, they did a correlation. We know correlation is not causation, but they found, okay, so what they did was they saw that the processing speed is low. Let me just get my notes. I got the accuracy. Sorry, the inaccuracy correlates with the low processing speed, I could possibly imagine. So they're less accurate with a lower processing speed, a response time speed. The response time is the way they're measuring it. So an overestimation going on. Maybe that shifting of allocation of attention to more stimulating rather than dull information due to so if you're overestimating, maybe you're kind of jumping ahead. You're jumping ahead to the stimulating information that's coming up, rather than trying to, attend to automatically the information that's coming up, that you need to store to be able to, make relationships between that stimuli. So yes. Distractibility will possibly be coming into that with this, maybe an over or hyper focus on a particular stimuli that's coming up. Is it working memory? Well, kind of, but not at the microsecond level, not at the millisecond level. So working memory is activated at a plus 1 second level. So processing speeds are a better predictor of a prospective temporal accuracy than working memory due to that very necessary rapid reaction time. Okay, so also, processing speeds affect information processing. So information that's coming in, temporal information necessary for good sequencing, or even, the information that is an audio information that is reliant on good temporal information processing is likely to be affected. And again, this happens at a millisecond speed. So it is not activating working memory. Working memory will be needed later to bring it all together. Right, so working memory, it's a deficit in processing temporal information at the millisecond level. It's also the research, especially early research by Barkley, one of the most famous writers in ADHD. There are deficits in the second level. It's not saying there isn't, but that is relatively well known now that there is a problem with working memory at that level. But they're suggesting very possibly that it might be related not to the working memory itself, but to an effect coming from the temporal processing at the millisecond level before memory is activated. And that's really interesting. Okay, great. So why is this all important? I guess you can imagine, well, executive functioning, guide and direct and manage our behavior. That was the plan, focus our attention, remember instructions. So if we're not getting the information that enables that to happen from the clock, if you like, then it's not going to be functioning well, right? This idea of a superior point of view, that you have a kind of that reasoning faculty, abstracting faculties, if that's not going to be working well, if everything's thrown out, if those signals are not being sent to that prefrontal cortex to really help us make superior point of view judgments. Okay, and also managing behavior, you need to do it before and during tasks, obviously, don't you, right? This idea of being able to control what you're experiencing and being able to respond appropriately to what you're experiencing. If you can't control that, then you're going to be inattentive and impulsive, maybe, and make wrong behavior choices. Not wrong the right word, no, probably not. Okay, and try not to be behaviorist, or I'm sounding very much so, but I'm doing it on purpose because, like I said, I want to get to the source of some of these problems. So what are we talking about? Well, a temporal domain control enables you to change your point of view based on prediction, anticipation, and response to situations. So if you have an inability, not an inability, but a difficulty in controlling that temporal domain, that's not just the clock. You don't have a lot of cognitive control of that. But when it sends information to parts of the brain, other parts of the brain that deal with other temporal problems, then that whole system kind of breaks down a bit. So the temporal domain control will be activated in different parts of the brain, but those signals might be being disrupted. So what we're dealing with, this is my perspective on this based on what I've read in the neuroscience, is that time perception issues are contributing to a malfunction in the system, cascading effects from that clock into the EF functions. So again, these are suggested from these studies. That obviously they're not absolutely proven, like nothing really is. But they're saying this could be what's happening, why that malfunctioning is happening in those kind of behavioral, emotional management parts of our brain. Time perception matters then. It's not just a funny quirk that me and my friend have when we can't meet up because he always turns up late and I always turn up early. So we end up having this wasted time in the middle. It's actually important for everyday functioning. And some of the research looked at college students struggling and due to these problems in their executive functioning that could be parts of their learning experience. Their learning experience could be addressed in some way where they could actually have better control. Okay, so why? Let's have a recap. Why is it important? Because they need to predict, they need to anticipate, they need to respond. They need to be able to do that to solve problems of planning and time management in general, but in specific tasks as well. Right, hopefully we're going to speed up a bit now. So problems when processing auditory stimuli, I mentioned it a little bit before, they're going to have problems in a delayed response, a kind of motor timing response, being able to respond directly to what they're processing. Even pressing a button requires good motor timing, and that could be very much influenced by this problematic temporal control. And coming back to phonemes, it's mentioned in the research about phonemes that phonemes require a fine temporal discrimination. Phonemes last for about 50 milliseconds, possibly even 40 if you've got very short. It's going to be very, very short, 40. Now, someone without ADHD is remarkably accurate. They might not get everyone, but they can make connections because they're getting many of them because they can process closer to that 40 or 50 milliseconds. But if the person with ADHD is plus 50 again, maybe 100, how many phonemes are they going to miss? Lots of them. So they're going to miss whole syllables, they're going to miss whole words possibly. If you ever look over the shoulder, some students, if you ever look over my shoulder and look at my notes, they're a disaster. It's a squiggle because I didn't really hear that. I didn't hear that. I didn't hear what they were saying. Or I might have A, B, and the rest of it's a squiggle. These are my notes for something I was doing earlier. You don't want to look at it. I'd throw that away. Okay, so yeah, I've witnessed this when I look at, and it could be just a simple processing, from L1 into L2, that kind of thing. But I'm sure in some cases with the high prevalence of ADHD, 2%, 3% possibly, and the fact it's underdiagnosed in some, or not diagnosed at all in some cultures, then we could assume there's going to be people with ADHD in our class, and that might be the reason why they're struggling. But again, helping with phonemes is going to help everyone, in my opinion. But also in syllables, if you imagine the temporal processing deficit at a very short interval, syllables are short too, and they affect speed and rhythm and precision throughout the rest of the upcoming temporal information. And general language skills might be affected. Syllables are distinguished by subtle differences in acoustic energy distribution I'm reading from my notes, by the way, you might notice. Yeah. Distinguished by subtle differences in acoustic energy distributions over very short periods of time. Sensitivity to such distributions can give rise to difficulties understanding spoken utterances. That should be obvious by this point. Okay, right, we're getting there, I promise. Okay, hopefully you're getting that. You can see that I've chosen some possible temporal processing problems here where we might start paying attention to or returning to. Bring back drilling, maybe. Let's have a talk about that in a minute. Okay, but let's think about the listener in class. We have an ideal listener. If we look at our tasks in our class, especially our EAP listening task, our EFL listening task, pretty much you're going to recognize it. But we have tasks to help learners, don't we? But we have tasks, in my opinion, that are helping neurotypical learners. The Chazal has recommended a number of tasks. Take a look at these. A number of tasks that are helpful, don't get me wrong. We all do these, don't we, in our EAP classes? We give them, if we think the lecture is a classic one that we might look at, where a lot of them have problems. We do help them prepare before lecture, don't we? We do listening for factual information. We go through tasks and we help them step by step how they might listen for factual information, don't we? We do all of that. We focus on the key language in the lecture, the language of association and speculation. We give them phrases that they can kind of learn and note into their notebooks. Then when they hear them, that they can recognize that it's speculation and all that. We give them tasks listening for association and evaluation, don't we? We do all of these and we're great at it, aren't we? Right? But we're thinking about a neurotypical learner. And we recognize that they might need to slow down and show and help with some of the phonology that goes with particular words and the signposts. We do a lot of signposting, don't we? Right? And how they might recognize when important information is coming up. And that's helpful to the ADHD listener, helpful for all listeners. But we need to do something more, don't we? Because maybe we just need to be focusing in things that we already do, but with a little bit more detail for particular learners. Now, we got task 5, which I'm very interested in, which is processing information from a lecture using notes. When I looked at that, I made my own notes and I put OMG, oh my God. Reprocessing information from lecture notes. Did you see my notes? We give them tasks, don't we? Cornell, note-taking, we give them those tasks and they're very helpful. It helps people with ADHD with their organization, right? So great, that's wonderful for those executive functioning. Perfect for it. Thank you so much. And I've been using those systems, but they fail very quickly. Why do they fail? Would anyone like to answer that question for me? Why do those things fail for myself and possibly for our students? You can shout out, I don't mind. So we got our notes, but how are they going to?
It's memory. Sorry, it's Nancy here.
Okay,
yeah,
thanks.
I'm thinking it's a problem with memory.
Absolutely.
What else? Putting them in the right order, the sort of organization of it.
Yeah. So that's like a sequencing problem.
Yeah, sequencing. Sorry. Yeah. But that's all from me for now.
Yeah, and imagine what it does assume, like my notes that are now on the floor. Why are they on the floor? Well, yes, they were absolutely not sequenced well. Obviously, my memory was not being activated well in this moment. But I would suggest straight away that the reason I can't process from my notes is that I wasn't processing well in the first place.
Yeah.
So I was getting single letters and words and fractions of, I thought I heard something and I probably didn't hear it correct. So I just scribbled it out and just threw it on the floor. That's, yeah, I mean, you want to see that? Okay, yeah, because it was all wrong that what I was noting down, what I was listening to when I re-listened to it. So yeah, I could reprocess as long as my notes were evidence of effective processing at that point. Right, now I'm going to invite you to look at another task in more particular detail. This is a task that's supposedly going to help our students with taking notes on the main points in a lecture, right? It's a great task. It's from my practice at Birmingham. Hopefully I've referenced it well, and anybody, if there's anyone from Birmingham, please don't get the police round. But it's a great task, right? It's a wonderful task, and I did use it last summer, and you know, it really did help the students. But I thought to myself, what might be the issue with this task for the ADHD listener? So I'm going to show you the task and point you to the questions, and I want you to think about it. You can make notes, you can add things into the chat, you can add answers into the chat, you can also speak out in the class as well. So here's the task 5, note-taking practice, identifying the main message. Great task, 20 minutes. That was difficult actually even for our neurotypical learners due to you know, obviously it was maybe a bit degraded. I remember the audio, but anyway. So listening to the next part of the talk, yeah, the speaker explains that sharing social media has multiplication effects on storytelling. Limit what you write down to key information about the points given below. So they've got the points, so they can organize their Cornell, for example. First multiplication effect, second multiplication effect, question this arises, share and revise your notes. I wouldn't share my notes. Okay, can you summarize from this? Okay, so that's a typical task. You might notice that kind of task, right? Okay, great. Now think about the questions on the left there. What in terms of listening skills construct are students assumed to be able to do here, right? Thinking about that ideal listener in a way. What would the ADHD listener likely struggle with this? And well, what can we do you think as a simple intervention that might help ADHD listeners with such a task? Like I said, you can put some notes in the chat or you can just speak out. So let's maybe start with the first question. What in terms of listening construct would you expect from this? Maybe I'll just get the chat open. Sorry about that. If only you can put something in the chat if you don't want to speak out loud. What kind of construct are you expecting here? What they expected to be able to do here? Listen for keywords. Yep. That's like, okay, listen for keywords. Okay, great. Well, we know that we support them, don't we, with that? We can help them with that, the kind of signposting. That is one way, but I mean, is that it? Okay, yes, good. Listening for patterns, sequencing of information. It's definitely assuming that they'll be able to do that, right? Yeah, listening for gist as well, like to get that kind of general understanding, like that's definitely something that I've always struggled with. Details and gist, great. Yeah, absolutely, listening for gist. Any other possible constructs there that they're expected to be able to do? Right, first and second, yeah, multiplication, that's right. This idea that like making associations, maybe, yeah. Like this idea, it's all well and good. They should be able to make an association. Yet we'll support them in trying to make those associations. But another note here is very important that you've put retain information, right? To be able to make those associations, linking those two effects, they'd need to be able to retain information at a rapid rate to be able to make that association. So even if you give them, here's a signpost, that once they get the signpost, they'd have to rapidly then shift attention to the upcoming stimuli or information, which is next in the sequence, if you like. What are the ones we've got? Understanding instructions, making choices. Yeah, the instructions. You should hear me trying to give instructions. Oh my God, I really shouldn't be a teacher. But I write them on paper. I literally read them out and I show them. I let the students read them as well. Okay. Yeah, understand. It's like making choices distinguish between the ideas in the moment. Yeah, in the moment, that online processing, right? I think this is one of the biggest, most important parts. This presupposes this presupposes this idea of the ideal listener, that they have temporal domain control. Most of this, in my perspective here, right, is that they are needing to have that basic temporal domain control to be able to do most of these tasks, to be able to process sequential information that's rapidly coming at them. Every phoneme is a piece of information that is coming at them at 40 to 50 milliseconds. If they're processing at 100 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds, it's gone. So yeah, all the things we're doing are great things. They're wonderful. But what can we do? So we've got these things in place. We've got signposting. We've got all of these things, and they're all great. But what can we do to address a problem at the very, very simple level, that they're just not processing information fast enough at the millisecond? What might we be able to do? Visualizations, breaking listening into small chunks. Yeah, chunking listening. I mean, the whole task is chunked. You know, the whole lecture is chunked, but we could chunk even more. Absolutely. So transcript, being able to follow, like I said about instructions, like letting them be able to read the instruction, as well as being exposed to just a spoken instruction. Talk about what they hear, right? Yeah, to go back over what they've heard in every stage as well. So you break down, you go back and with feedback, go through every single part. Recording conversations, repeat, repeat, repeat. Alex, I'm with you on that. It sounds like, oh my God, the behaviorists, it's the 1950s again. We're going to get them drilling. Absolutely, we're getting them drilling. Decrease the speed of recording. You're with me. You're with me. Right. So I'm going to suggest one more thing before we discuss more openly, and you have any questions for me after that. So I want to talk about, sorry, I looked into the neuroscience a little bit more, and you're like, oh my God, here we go again, right? But okay, I'm going to bear with me on this, that if you think about learning at that neurological level, why drilling might be necessary to bring it back. Not that maybe some of you didn't get rid of it, but I read particular research by Talal about not specifically ADHD, but left hemisphere language impairment problems. So again, there's not a lot of research about this specifically with ADHD, but I think it could be transferable. Now, let's take a look at that a minute. So hopefully we can, let me just get that away. It's not. Okay, there it is. Okay, so I got this action. Okay, great. So I thought, right, I'm going to suggest something, and then we can start suggesting more and start discussing the problems that might arise from all of this. So yeah, so bringing back drilling, neuroplasticity. Sounds horrible, doesn't it? Bring back drilling, training. You're right. Now, some research with ADHD specific have suggested training, speeding up processing, rhythm in stress, music, how musicality of language, this kind of the music training has helped people with ADHD. A lot of musicians who have ADHD said that, oh, music's really helped them in other aspects of their lives. It's helped them kind of focus and pay attention. I wonder why, right? So it's already mentioned in the ADHD literature, but Talal recommends remediation. That sounds awful, that word, but this idea of raising phonemic awareness, processing, adjusting, the rate of auditory sequel processing, attention, memory, and possibly even syntax. So that's sequential building out towards the bigger builder blocks of language, up even to syntax, understanding whole long utterances. Wouldn't that be amazing? So why do they suggest this, and what's the evidence for this? Well, some neurons code select the temporal features of sound, from phonemes through to syllables through to words. Exaggeration of those features helps us, if you think in early childhood development, parentese, baby talk, those obsessive exaggerations help train our brain to notice sequentials in language. So we kind of predict, anticipate, and are able to respond due to those temporal distributions. We have acoustic waveform across sounds, enables chunking of time in milliseconds. So not having to process at the very small millisecond, you can chunk into clear chunks of time. Really helps with discrimination of different chunks as well. Increasing and decreasing durations of sequential sounds repeatedly has been found to improve thresholds to near normal. So someone with a language impairment, if we keep increasing and decreasing and increasing and decreasing, like suggested in the comments there, wonderful. Over time, this increasing and decreasing can help train back to kind of actually recognize and being able to predict and anticipate at a very rapid speed. And that's maybe what's happening with our musician with ADHD, who's realized that over time that their aspects of their life are improving in terms of anticipating and predicting because they've been training themselves in some sense. Okay, so remediation training, it sounds controversial and you can completely disagree with me, I don't mind. So apparently, possibly, she's not claiming it's absolutely true, but it's possibly not proven that multiple neurons that fire simultaneously from this kind of training bind together. And once they start binding together, they get that kind of sequencing down to a T. And then from there, send messages to other parts of the brain that manage different time aspects, such as working memory, and provide it with the information that it needs to store. Fascinating. Okay, increasing connectivity. So this kind of spiking of exaggerated input allows those neurons to record and then reach out to another neuron, create boom, boom, boom connection all the way through the system. This connectivity can drive the development of predictive rules that govern language, phoneme order, word segmentation, etc., etc., etc. Right. If you've got all of that, that's great. So this is why bringing back drilling, but not just, it's awareness. It's not just drilling. You don't just do drilling, we do awareness. I've got another possibility there. Why don't you just forget all of this? When they go into lectures, just give them frequency modulation systems to cut out all the distractive noise. Yeah, but it still won't help them with the processing necessarily. So what suggestions have you got? What other ways, maybe it's this, what other suggestions could we do in a kind of general way of addressing listening issues with ADHD? Do we have to chat? Okay. Oh, okay. Okay, what other ways might we work with this? You can put in the chat or say out loud, I don't mind. Okay, this idea of reading aloud. Again, do you remember that's kind of suggested as a is not a good thing to do, like reading aloud. The reasons why I think is because obviously when you're trying to read, that the attention the attentional process kind of get you to kind of, I don't know, maybe overthink sounds or that you end up robotic. But I'm sure there's some role for it. But back chaining, great. So how do you think back chaining might be related to the remediation? I haven't mentioned a particular method apart from increasing and decreasing, but back chaining is, I'll be honest, it's something I haven't done a lot of, because I'll tell you why. Not being able to sequence well myself, so I get confused about how to do the back chaining. So I kind of like avoid it, but I do agree with you that it could be useful. Yeah, while drilling, because often drilling might be kind of one directional. Yeah, so back chaining while drilling is pretty useful, I would suggest, or you would suggest. Okay. Any other possibilities? Okay, so I've been forcing this issue of how to address temporal domain control, this idea that I think we need to look back at other interdisciplinary literature, that we're just looking at kind of what students might struggle with in class and doing interpretive research. It's really important. That is important research. But if they're saying, I don't know why it's happening, but I really have struggle keeping up in class, then, you know, how do we know what's maybe influencing that problem? So this is a suggestion today that this time perception problem can be addressed by returning to or giving a bit more attention to these methods that maybe we don't use so much. I remember at Birmingham one year, somebody said to me, "Oh, why do we have to do? Why would you do kind of pronunciation in your class? Why would you do that?" It's like, he said, we don't have time to do that. They've got to write essays. That's the thing they're going to do the most. And I said, yeah, but they also got to spend a whole year on a master's program listening, right? And even back then, before I read the neuroscience research, I was like, yeah, we're having problems listening. They're having problems listening, not just as a second language, but for other reasons. Like maybe I have problems listening. Okay, do we need to raise a lot of more awareness of this with teachers and lecturers so they can put? Yeah, that was an interesting question, wasn't it? Like maybe that can bring me to my bit where it says discussion. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Awareness of this with teachers and lecturers. So, I mean, this is where the conversation between practitioners in EAP and those in the so-called academic departments. I know at Glasgow we work well together with the masters in T-cell, but we probably don't have much influence on what's going on in other departments. So yeah, like they need to maybe a bit of a sit down. They need to adjust their own practices in some way. A lot of I remember the ones you always remember the lectures, don't you? That even for a neurotypical, that you might actually. They're memorable. Why were they memorable? Because they did the things that are good practice, the slowing down, the repetition, the returning to main points, exaggerating, seemingly kind of in a ridiculous way, like the baby talk, not baby talk, but maybe like I'm doing, but this is just how I am. So like, that is helpful. But could be a part of their training in terms of the the PG, what they call it, diploma in higher education teaching. Like I'm sure they do things like that in that, but like it could be a part of like an inclusive learning about that some learners need extra in certain areas. Maybe projecting keywords on the screen while listening. Kind of happens in kind of your standard lecture, doesn't it? In your standard lecture, but also it's good practice, isn't it? In our own classes, is this what you mean by that? Like, that projection, like in our own practices, we would do that as we're kind of training them with these particular processing issues. Yeah. Because in a lecture slides, there's a lot of limited information, or there's too much information. And some of the research that I read, that the intrusion of visual information can slow down processing even more. So it's like, oh my God, so what do we do with all the keywords on the screen? I can't answer that question right now. It needs to be research about how that interference of visual information as well as the auditory information, how they might be clashing with each other with an ADHD person who seemingly can't focus on more than, on the two things at the same time. Okay, so we've also got, it would also help for teachers to have increased levels of awareness that they might have students with ADHD, something we may not know. So that's interesting, yes. Like even in the CPD on among our own staff who don't obviously maybe have interest in a presentation or what we've done today, like it could be incorporated, couldn't it, into CPD? But there are problems of all of this, isn't it? It's like, how much can we do in terms of adding more to CPD? Yeah, exactly. I absolutely agree with you, Alex. This idea that they're a problem. We've made great ways of that, haven't we? This idea of neurodiversity, like everyone's brain is different from each other, right? But when you bring in kind of factors which are basically a neurological, biological factor that is creating a kind of an exaggerated problem, then we need to be aware that that is actually relatively common. That dyslexia is very common, very relatively common, not very common. ADHD is relatively common. If it's present in the UK, I don't remember the percentages, but the low, like 4 or 5% of children, and in adults it gets down to like 1 or 2%. But it can be, that they've obviously exposed to some good training down the, that they've actually maybe got help along the way. Encouraging students to make notes when listening. I agree with that, but remember the problem of making notes whilst listening would presuppose that you're able to process the minute information at even the phoneme level. So yeah, they really should be taking notes, obviously. But I think they should, I think nowadays I don't know what happens in your practice, what happens in your universities, that I know that we do it a lot across many programs, is that we do record lectures and they get a chance to go back through the lecture themselves. And yet they'll be able to slow it down, repeat. They might be able to bring up captions, but they're probably going to be inaccurate. If it's a Zoom recording, then the recording captions there might be better than the average kind of online ones. But they're still they're going to have to listen to that stimuli, those phonemes, for example, which are coming at them at the same rate. And those phonemes are not being slowed down and sped up and slowed down and sped up, even if we go back to the recording and listen again and again and again. Okay, I'm just trying to keep up with the comments. Teachers being unaware of how to help students with it are the problem. Yeah, I think, often if something is a minority issue, then often we might think, okay, we don't need to respond to that. And don't you think that you can disagree with me that a lot of the problem, not a problem, but necessarily a problem, but in EAP, how we also focused on the academic purpose of their listening, that we forget to kind of focus on the fundamentals of listening. They're like, oh, we just need to get them to be able to do this so that they're successful in a lecture. Yeah, I know we don't have much time to help, but if we're an in-sessional course, might be able to not have to be so obsessive about things such as effective note taking, and it might be more focused on kind of that remediation training for those who want to do it. It doesn't have to be ADHD. Reacting to just teachers being unaware of. Okay, so I was reading that and then realized it was a reaction. Yeah, transcript can absolutely help, but maybe not in the moment, right? Because that necessary kind of auditory and visual, the visual element of reading is going to disrupt processing even further. There are apps. I've been trying to look at the up-to-date ones, but there was one which I think Talal actually recommended. Let me just grab it. It's quite old now, but there must have been updated versions of it. It's not an English language learning specific app, but it's one based on neuroplasticity training. So I think that there could be ones that are more related to directly to speech processing, but one is called Fast for Word. It's probably completely out of date now, but I think it's the idea that speeding up their neuroplasticity training can actually help with with eventually being able to process speech. And in Talal's work, it was actually about dyslexia, and she had even a bigger leap to go, because making a connection between speech, receiving speech, and the connection with actual reading. But she thinks there is probably a connection there. So yeah, I mean, maybe you can get out there and look for if there are some more speech processing kind of remediation training apps out there as well. Maybe we can create our own. That would be amazing. We could actually get ones which can help in our specific context. Right, I'm aware of the time, which is great. That means I've got the time right in front of me, which I'm pretty much coming up to the end there. Right. Right, thank you. I don't really have to add any more to that, but I'd like to leave that with you. And my email address is there at the bottom, charles.marshall@glasgow.ac.uk. I don't know what's in capitals, but it's the PowerPoint thing that I chose. Here are some references. This is my students do. Here are some references. Boom, boom, boom. Some of them. So yeah, I'll just show that screen there. Thank you. Thank you for your, albeit maybe not extensive, a lot of me talking, but thank you so much for your contributions.
This has been really, really thorough, and your research is very, very useful, because most teachers are unaware of these the difficulties, and listeners with this special,
Yeah,
disorder.
absolutely.
And thank you everyone for attending. We have I have put in the chat a feedback form. We're always asking for impressions and opinions about our events, as well as a certificate of attendance. I will post it again in the chat for anyone who has missed it. Are there any questions for Charles?
They're like, no, my brain is now frazzled from all that neuroscience. Don't worry, mine is too, by the way. But I've connected loads of neurons recently with all that.
Yeah, I think you should write about it, Charles.
Oh, yeah, this is obviously the beginning stage.
About creating this app, to help students and teachers.
I saw one on time estimation training one, which was doing some of those time estimation and discrimination tasks, and I tried it out, and yeah, my scores were pretty bad. But that wouldn't help to kind of it wouldn't be remediation training, would it? It would be like just showing that you're failing all the time without kind of helping you to speed it up. So yeah, I'd like to do some remediation training and then go back and try that task once more.
Mm-hmm. So can I ask you something? As a teacher, how can I diagnose, let's say, that a student has this difficulty, apart from the obvious, I
think it's very difficult in sort of class time, in the class context. I think we've got so much to do ourselves in this moment, and students have got a lot to do. It can go unnoticed, and especially imagine that processing speeds are such in the milliseconds, so short. You don't know if they've processed or not. They don't know if they've processed or not. But when they look at their notes later, they're like, nope, I didn't process, right? What I've noticed is, because I'm in a way fortunate that I know I can see signs anecdotally from my own experiences about how my notes look. When I walk around the class and I look at students' notes, and I'm like, oh my God, right? Now, I'm not going to diagnose them, obviously, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I'm going to suggest, yeah, I might ask them, you know, I could, if you've got the luxury of tutorial, I've had a few tutorials with students and I asked them specifically about language skills that they're struggling with, and they always say listening. Everybody says listening. You probably have the same. And on the pre-sessional, a few students, when they said they were really struggling with listening and actually did in some of the tasks, I noticed them. I focused on them like, okay, so you admitted to struggling with listening. Who is actually struggling, you know, in a kind of way that's really affecting their work? And in the next, I made a note of who they were. In the next meeting we had, I said, okay, so I noticed that you were struggling with the listening. You know, rather than saying, how do you think I can help you? I said, I think I can help you. Right. And then, you know, on a good pre-sessional program like we have at Birmingham, I said, hey, why don't you, you know, you can go for extra pronunciation practice. And believe me, the pronunciation practice, if you've got good awareness raising in those sessions and lots of repetition, can actually help you so much. And they're like, yeah, but my pronunciation is great. I said, it's not about improving your pronunciation. It's about recognizing those sounds that are coming into your head, right? And by doing that, that can help like anyone. I'm not, you know, all second language learners are going to struggle with that in some way, especially if they're not doing a lot of listening before they arrive in the UK. And then you might be catching someone with ADHD, especially those who are undiagnosed. And we're suggesting that.
What was the other title you thought of? I think that was much more catchy.
Eye-catching, yeah, yeah. I should have gone with that, shouldn't I? Like bring back drilling. Yeah, bring back chaining. I think back chaining is still kind of relatively politically okay.
Great. Okay, we should let everyone go. Thank you very, very much for attending. And thank you, Charles, for a great talk.
No problem. Thank you very much.